born in Bordelon in 1906, April the 8th, 1906. I lived right next to the church. When I was old enough, the priest used me as his private altar boy. He used me as an altar boy.
Okay, that's good.
I used to make about 3 masses every Sunday, 2 in Bordelonville and 1 in Kleinwood. Used to ride with him. The wine that was left, I used to drink it coming back. After eating dinner, a friend of mine by the name of Pat Juno usually would come by the house and we'd each get on a little horse and take off, go in the woods. We'd take a little fishing gear, which was composed of a line, a hook, and a little pole that we would cut after we get into the woods. We'd bring a little skillet, some syrup, and a piece of bread for each one of us. We'd go up and fish, catch a few fish, make a little fire, other fish, and eat. And each one of us had a little, what we used to call at that time, a nigger shooter. I think they called it a slingshot today. And we'd go up and shoot little birds and kill time. Then we'd climb a tree, a small tree, and then we'd bend that tree and come down. And when it hit the ground, we'd let it go and it'd fly up again. Then if we find a good place where we could go swimming, we'd take all our clothes out and jump in the water and swim a while, get back on our mule after that, on our horses or mules. Sometimes I had a good racking mule. That's the one I usually use. And we'd come back home. I had 2 brothers, 2 sisters. We were 5 in the family. I went to, after I finished high school, I went to college. I went to Natchitoches. Papa sold a little piece of property and he made a mortgage on the other part, and I borrowed money with him, and he told me the money that you pay back will go to educate my older brother, who was next. So I finished college, went to work as a school teacher in Kaplan. Each month I would send some money home. Papa would take that money and send my brother to, he went to Southwestern, played basketball at Southwestern, baseball and football. While I was at Normal, I took part in sport. During those days, you played because you liked the sport. I got 10 cents an hour for the work that I was doing at Natchitoches while I was in school. I used to line tennis court. I worked in a library and in a dining room. My brother did the same thing when he went to Southwestern. He worked while he was up there, and he saved money and sent my sister to school. So we all had either a college education or close to it. The younger brother quit school before he finished Southwestern, because during those days, harvesting people would come to Southwestern and or visit all the colleges and hire some of the fellows who were interested in that field. And John Deere needed a draftman, so he quit college just before finishing and went to work with him. And he stayed up north around Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Davenport, in that area. He worked for 4 or 5 different companies. He married a girl from that area. After I came back to Kaplan, from the summer that I would spend at home, after 3 years, I became principal of that. In the meantime, I met a young lady from Gideon, who was teaching in Gideon, originally from Ruston. Her name was Sarah Fletcher. We got married in 1936, I believe. I'm not too good at remembering dates. But we both went to work. Sarah was working for the welfare at first, and then later on she went get on. And then in the latter years, she moved to Kaplan and taught in Kaplan. She was teaching 8th grade most of the time. While she was in Gedon, she was teaching 6th grade. During the summer, while I was going to college, I played baseball with the Natchitoches of a semi-pro team. One summer I spent it in Florida working at a sawmill. The other part of the summer I played with the Marksville on a baseball team up there. I need a rest right now.
Some other stories from when you were growing up, that's okay. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
We have like an overview now. If you want to go back, you can go back.
While I was going to high school, Daddy used to have lots of pigs, and they were half wild pigs, as we call them. They were domestic pigs that were left in the woods on their own. And we used to go up 3 or 4 times during the year. First, we built a little house. It was so far out that we had to spend at least one night while we were running up the pigs. At times, Papa had as many as 500 or 600 pigs scattered in the woods. He had a dog, a white dog, I remember, called Snow. Snow was trained that when we meet one of the group of pigs up there and we see the sow, Papa would count the number of tits that were being used, and he knew how many little pigs were being the sow had. Then old Snow would go around and he'd put his front paws on the little pig when he'd find one, and Papa would catch him and then he'd mark him. The way he recognized his pigs, that each fella had a registered mark in the counter seat, the parish seat. And his was bout coupé and through and called dessus and called dessous l'oreille à pointy, meaning that you cut the end of the ear, make a hole in the middle, and 2 oval, one at the top and the bottom, and the next one you cut it like a triangle. That was his mark for his pigs. Each fella had his mark. When we'd go up there, we'd usually spend a couple of nights. We'd take some syrup, some bread, and water, because the water wasn't too good. You'd bring about 5 gallons of water. But at my age, I was usually with camp boy. We had a big log that we dropped right next to the camp, and I'd haul lots of wood right next to the log, and then we'd light a fire, and then we'd take 2 green small trees and drive them in the ground, and then hang a wire from one to the other, and then we'd hang the little roast pig on this, and I'd build a big fire right next to that log, and the little roast pig was right in front of it, and my job was to keep them moving, spinning around until they were cooked. Pigs were small, so small that at time each fellow would take a little pig and he'd sit down there and he'd eat once a day. And then usually when they'd get back from they'd leave in the morning, in the morning they usually ate some eggs, boiled eggs, and a piece of toast. And in the afternoon, they stay out all day and drive the pigs in and out of the pen. And then I was cooking. And just about a half hour before sundown, everybody would quit. And we'd each take a little pig. Sometimes if it were big, we'd take a half a little pig and sit down there with some syrup and bread. That was our meal for that day. When I was a little older, I used to go hunt while they were driving the pigs, and there were lots of squirrels. And when we were cooking squirrel, we used a big black pot with little legs underneath, and we put the squirrels in there, and we'd skin them, and instead of using One of the summers I remember, I'm going from one part to the other because I haven't prepared anything on that. One summer I worked in New Orleans. During those days, we used to have high water that would come in our area about every other year. And I remember in 1927, we had 12 feet of water in the yard at home. I used to drive a boat and park right on the roof. Use the roof as a landing part. And right after so lots of the people from Bordelon left and they went to New Orleans. That's the days that they were running the streetcars. And some of them were conductors and some of them they used a motorman and a conductor, I think they called it. One would collect the fares and the other would run the streetcars. I worked in an American can factory the first summer I went in there. I guess I was about the 11th grade. I walked in there, and the fella put me in a big boxcar with a Greek fella weighed about 250 pounds and muscle. That I hated. I thought it was his leg. Was the first time I looked at his arm, and then he was loading tomato paste can, and they'd come down a chute, and he'd grab them just as fast as they come in there and throw them, and none of them would fall. And he said, do it like that. I watched them a while, and I started, and about the fifth time I hit the thing, they fell. I put them back in there, then the whole damn thing came down. He started after me, and I climbed the fence, and I jumped out. I never did go back to the American can factory again. Then from there, I went to Grunewald Hotel, had a dance hall, club, I guess it was, private club at the West End. It was built on top of the water. The boats would come underneath during Prohibition. They'd come in there with all imported whiskey. Most of those fellas from New Orleans would take a date, which wasn't our wife most of the time, and they'd come up after the shoot and then dance and drink. I remember one night we were just ready to close up, and a bunch from Bucktown, this was the toughest place in New Orleans at that time, showed up. They all had been at a wedding, and yes, it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they sat down at this long table. Most of them had more than they could stand, and they ordered each a sandwich. And when the fella presented the bill, he charged them cover charge. He said, cover charge for what? He said, you didn't have a dance, a band here? He says, cover charge. The fella reached down there and he brought out a 45. He said, no cover charge. So I don't remember if they paid for the bill or not, but they took off. That was a tough country. Life was altogether different today. We used to get up in the morning as a little youngster, go pick a cotton until breakfast time, just enough time that we could go to school, get to school on time, walk to school all the time. And then we'd get back, our dinner, instead of having a lunchroom with a balanced meal, it was a gallon bucket with a few cracklings, some syrup, and a piece of bread. When we got back home in the afternoon, and we usually ate a sweet potato, some more crackling, a piece of sausage, and then go pick cotton until dark. When the cotton crop was over, usually they had a few spots of cotton left in the field, and Papa couldn't see anything white in the field. If he saw one a half a mile away, he'd go get a piece of cotton, and we called it the grenade. He said, now all this is yours. You can use it to buy some clothes if you want to. So we'd go up and pick the little cotton we could, and then we'd go buy a shirt or something. On Saturdays, we used to go, when the cotton crop was over, we used to go in the field, in the woods, and then thick moss. And we take this green moss and bring it in and keep watering it, and then it get dark. And there was a fella in our area that would buy that black moss, and they use it for mostly in cars at that time. They would stuff the seats with the moss. People would also use it to make mattresses. This fellow ran this mill, and he baled it just like you would bale hay. He'd sell those bales to different areas of the country. When I was about 12 years old, Papa was running a grocery store. And during that day, people would buy, all the goods would come in bulk size. And somebody would come in there with a nickel of sugar, dime of sugar, and we have to put it in a little bag and then wrap it up. And right next to the store, Papa had a warehouse. He'd keep all of the heavy bulk material in the warehouse. And I remember the warehouse was sat way above the ground, because sometimes the high water would come, and to keep it from going into the store, all the houses were on pillars. In this store, I used to go underneath the store when I was a little fella and take all of this thread spool and run a nail through it so that it would spin. And I'd have me some little derricks and little drag lines, and by pulling little strings. So I always would get kind of hungry. I made a hole in the grocery store where Papa kept his condensed milk. I love that little can of condensed milk. So I'd go in the store, do as if I was walking, and I'd drop 2 or 3 little cans of condensed milk through the hole. And then while I was working up that was they didn't have such thing as Coke, the bottle stuff, as far as I remember during those days. But I love that condensed milk. Right up in 27, the high water. I was going to school in Acton. I was in the National Guard, and when the high water covered all of that area in Avoyelles Parish, we were sent to Avoyelles Parish, and I ran a barge. This barge was a cattle barge. We loaded cattle, and we could load people. So I had a outboard motor hooked back of the barge, and I'd go up and get goods that people wanted from their homes and bring it back to the highland, which was in Mansura. One day I stopped at they had a cut where the levee broke. The water gusted so fast in that it made big holes in the roads. And one thing that happened in that, they had one of them broke right next to the Catholic church. They had a butane tank in that church. And somewhere or the other it exploded and caught fire as the water was coming in there, and the church burnt. And little further down, the levee broke in 2 places, about a half a mile. One side of the levee had water up to 10 feet high, and the other didn't have any water. So as soon as it would break in that, the water would gush so fast in that it would make holes in the road, and on the dry side, 10, 15 feet deep, and maybe in a diameter of 100 feet, 150 feet, depending. But it broke at 2 places close to each other, and the water came in so fast. One fella said he started to make coffee, and before the water boiled, the water was in his house, and it put the fire out. But that's how fast that water was coming through. All of the wild animals would be moving in toward, and you could find them on the levee. And some of them would jump on would ride old logs and parts of houses and with the water. I stopped one time when one of those cuts up there, and I came a little close with the boat, and I had it loaded with a bunch of people, and it was a fight between me and the motor and the current. And for a long time, I thought we were going through that current, but we finally moved away from it and got back on the levee after I crossed the current. That was a lesson. Next time I made a big round around that cut, because that thing is so strong sometimes that the log would come in there, and when it get right in the middle, the log would keep spinning around, and the first thing you know, it would go in and dive, and it'd come out maybe 10, 15 yards away up out of the water. The floods at that time just about ruined that country. Yet people would go right back and build their houses, and clean up, and start farming again. Today, they built a protective levee from Mansura going through Simsport through new roads up there, and with dams that they built up north since 1927, they had very little water, none on the protective side, a little on the other side. In the last 5 or 6 years, I don't think they had any water at all. And it seems as if they hold the water before it gets through the area that it used to flood. The flooding part was started in what we call the highland down there in Mansura, swinging around through Simsport and back to the Gulf, work its way through the lowland. One summer, I stayed in the new roads, and when they built the protective levee, they had to go through the marsh and the swamp, and the engineer was running the line through it, and 5 or 6 of us were helping, and we worked ahead of them so that they could shoot the line, and we had to cut the small trees, and when they get to a big tree, then he'd go around and take 2 measurements, 3 measurements to get back in a straight line. I was with the group that ran the first line for the protective levee from Mansura up to Simsport. When Mother was 92 years old, she came home and spent 2-3 weeks. And while she was home, I asked her to do what I am doing now. But she did it in French. She told me, starting her early life and what she remembered about Papa's family. I asked her how she had met Papa. She said during those days, every Sunday afternoon they would meet and they play croquet, and that she met Papa while in one of those games, and then from now on they went together. So I asked her about Papa's people. He says that my name is Belisaire. I am named for my grandfather. My daddy's name was Emmanuel. Emmanuel's daddy was Belisaire. She was telling me something I didn't know at that time, that during the Civil War, he was living, Grandpa was living nearly in the wild. He was raising a few little pigs. Most of the food they had to raise. And he was farming. He had 5 children. They came in there and they told him he had to go fight. He didn't know why he was fighting. He had to go somewhere and fight. Most of those people didn't know how to read or write. There wasn't any school in that area at all. The only education that Papa had was a traveling man came through and he would stay at a certain home, and people would go up there for classes. And then the next year, another fellow would come. But during Grandpa's days, it didn't have this. So they lived, sold few things like pigs and cattle, and the rest of the stuff that they raised for their own. They took him and sent him up. The last she heard of him, he was in Virginia. The mother stayed in there with 5 children that she took care of. How, nobody knew how in the world she could raise those 5 kids. She couldn't farm. They raised little pigs, and at night they had a bunch of them who were deserters and who didn't want to go to, they'd hide in the woods, and they'd come at night and steal most of her stuff. But when the war was over, Grandpa was in West Virginia, and they told him to go home. He had lost an eye, and he was wounded also in the leg. They hadn't heard from him. They didn't know where he was it dead or anything. But they finally got a letter from an old lady in Shreveport. He had worked his way in Shreveport. He had pneumonia, and she was taking care of him. So Grandma got 2 fellas with a little wagon, and they hitched 2 mules to the wagon, and they took off to go to Shreveport. It took them a whole month for them to go up and come back. When on the way, they put a mattress in there. They put him, and on the way he got so sick they had to stay at somewhere. She didn't remember what place, but they stayed there. Somebody took care of him until he got well enough to get back on that mattress and come back home. And finally got back up there, and I do remember exactly. I don't know exactly where he went from there, but Mama told me that he finally got a pension. He gave him $5, and he took that pension, and instead of giving Grandma took the old lady. Grandpa died, and then Grandma lived, and she went over to live with Mama's people, and then she would give the money to somebody else. And I remember she had arthritis, all the fingers were curled up. The thing that's hard to understand is why people that owned the slave took off and went up north or somewhere like that and got these people who didn't know anything about slavery go up there and fight for them. It just don't make sense. And, well, most wars are that way anyway. So I volunteered. I went in as a chief, petty officer. That I was in Gene Cuney's program. It was the training unit that I was around 36 years. But the only thing I could do was to do that type of work. They were looking for people who could do that type of training and also handle a group of men, youngsters who would come in as to follow them through the recruiting period of time and answer their problem, be with them. And so they didn't appoint me for this. I didn't go into that type of work. They used me as a trainer. I first went to Norfolk, and then from Norfolk, after I finished with my boot training, I went to Corpus Christi. I went to a radar school. I had charge of I worked in the physical ed department. We'd get the boys, I guess they had about 3,000 boys in the radar school right next to the air base at Corpus Christi. We give them exercise and work with them when they were not in class, just like they do in high school today. And then from there, I got a commission, and they sent me to Sampson, New York. I stayed in Canandaigua. Sarah came over while I was up there. She spent about a month. Guy, our youngest, our old boy, your first boy, was just walking up at that time. I stayed in Corpus Christi. I was in charge of the training program. We had 5,500 youngsters in school taking different courses while they were in training. We'd get them, we'd run it, the place was run just like a big college. We'd get the boys every hour, a certain class, and we had two or three big gyms. Everyone had to learn how to swim. The first thing when they came up there, we'd undress every one of them. We didn't ask them whether they could swim or not, make them get on the high board and jump. If they couldn't swim to the end, we'd give them a pole and pull them out, and then put him in a room, and then get his name and tell him. We'd put him in beginning. Those that could swim, we let them go, and then they'd come to different classes. But they had to learn how to swim underwater. They had to learn to undress in the water and make life preservers out of a shirt, a pants, all of the routines that they have to do if one of the ship would get hit and they didn't have a life preserver, how they could save their life. If oil was being burnt, they'd have to dive and go underneath and swim so far underwater. But those that could swim would go into that type of class. Those that couldn't would come at night on their own, and they learned to swim until they could go into the other classes. I had charge of that type of work. I stayed in that 2.5 years and then came back to Kaplan. In 1927, right after I had finished college at Natchitoches, I came in as a coach and an assistant principal, a teacher. I was teaching 5 classes, coaching boys basketball, girls basketball, track, and boxing. During those days when you get paid, you didn't have any money. The bank wouldn't cash the checks, so you just had a piece of paper. You had to find something to do with it. So we found a fella in Bordelon, which is a little town not far from Kaplan, who would cash the script, and they charged us 10%. Sarah when she was teaching, she'd make $60 a month. Then she paid 10% to cash the script. I spent, after 3 years as a coach and principal, I became the principal, got in trouble he and the school board members couldn't get along, and they didn't have tenure that way, so they fired him and appointed me. I was in Bordelonville. I had decided to quit school because I had less money after teaching 3 years than I had before I started. So I told Dad, I said, they can't go on that way. I got to find somewhere that I can make some money. But I get the telegram saying I was appointed principal. I didn't know what was happening. So I came to Kaplan at night. In the meantime, after I got a telegram that I was principal, I get another telegram saying, don't accept because we don't want you here. So I go find out what happened. So I went in there and found out it was a fight between the superintendent and the principal and the school board members. The school board members told me, you have a job, you don't have to worry. Okay. So I went to see the principal. He and I were good friends. And he says, you better not go up, I won't even give you the keys. What you think, I'm fired on the other job? I said, I don't have a job anymore. They appointed another fellow in my place, and they appointed me in your place. He said, I wouldn't accept. Okay. So I went back and I talked to some of my friends to go ahead and take it. So I became principal. We had 1,100 students at that time, maybe 1,200. The principal had the elementary school and the middle school and the high school, all in one. So I stayed up until I never did change school. I just battled it through all kind of problems, but we finally made it.
I'm Sarah Fletcher, and I'm sitting just like my mother always taught me to sit. She used to spend hours teaching us. We'd all sit in the living room, very formally. She would make each one of us sit, and she'd stand at the door, and she would watch. And she'd make us stand. When we went to sit again, we must have our dress just right. We must not wrinkle it in the back. I guess one reason was because the dresses were so hard to iron, but we had to sit just right. When we left the house, we had to stand just right. Our head had to be held just right. As we walked down the street, our neighbors were on their front porch, and if we weren't walking just right, each would yell at us and say, "Get your chin up, hold your shoulders up, let's go." That wasn't just one time told to us. It was told to us several times along the hill that we lived in. I wasn't born in the house that we're living in right now. I was born on the next street, on North Trenton Street. The house that I'm living in right now belonged to the Presbyterian Church. But my mother loved that house so much. After the Presbyterian Church got a minister, Mother and Daddy and their family at that time had to move, and they moved over to Trenton Street. We were not living very far from my grandparents' home. They had moved to North Louisiana from Montgomery, Louisiana, where they owned a big farm. But they were getting old, and they had moved to Ruston. Of course, my mother had to follow, and she was living there then, too. When I was born, my grandmother was very ill. My brother Joel was 13 years old. He claims that he took care of me from the time I was a tiny baby until after my grandmother died, which was about the month of April after I was born. He vows that he used to stick safety pins in me just to hear me cry. I expect he did because he was a very mischievous little boy. But at any rate, our affection grew, and we were always very close to one another. He claimed that it was because he took care of me when I was a baby that he loved me so much as I grew older. From the house that we lived in on North Trenton Street, my daddy bought a house out on the Shreveport Highway. It was a very large house, had great big columns in the front, 2-story. I can remember there was a long hall that went down the middle, made an L shape. On one side was a great big parlor, which we were not ever allowed to go into, for it was too formal for us to ever sit in. On the opposite side of the parlor was a bedroom, and it had a beautiful bedroom set in it that belonged to my grandmother, and she had always said that it was to be mine because I was born. When she was so sick, she left instructions that that bedroom set was to go to me. Back of that was a dining room. I can remember the great big table and the sideboard. On the sideboard, there was a great big, beautiful dish of a turkey. And I thought it was the most gorgeous dish I had ever seen. And then, of course, the kitchen was back of that. I don't remember too much about the house, for I was very small. The house burned. They say I kept them from saving very much in the house because I thought the fire was beautiful. I thought that was the prettiest fire I had ever seen in all my life. That was the prettiest sight I had ever seen. And I ran out in the front yard and sat in the swing and swang and looked at it. My mother was upstairs. She had a great big trunk that she had valuables that had come down in her family from North Carolina. My uncle and aunt were not married at that time, and she was saving all the valuables for the three of them to be divided at a later date. She got the trunk up on the upstairs gallery, but she never got it over because someone yelled, "Sarah is missing. Sarah is in the fire." Excitement was really all around. Everyone finally someone crossed the street, and they found me swinging in the swing, admiring that blaze. It was beautiful. After that, we kind of lived with one family and another family, and my mother was very unhappy. She wanted to go back and live up on the hill in the old Presbyterian manse. She told my daddy she didn't want to live any other place. And when my mother said that she didn't want to live any other place, she meant that she didn't want to live in any other place. My daddy owned some property in Shreveport, very valuable property. So he went before the board at the Presbyterian church, and he told them if they would let him have the manse, the old Presbyterian manse in which my mother had lived in when she first moved to Ruston, that he would exchange the manse with them for the house. Of course, they jumped at the idea of getting this valuable property in Shreveport, and they told him it was all right, that he could move back up on the hill by the Grahams. Mama was very happy to move because all of her friends lived around her. It was a Presbyterian hill. Everyone up there abided by all the rules of the Presbyterian church. You went to church on Sunday. You first went to Sunday school, then you went to church, then you studied your Bible in the afternoon, then Christian Endeavor at night, church again. We followed that all the way through college. No one ever varied. You didn't dare miss any of those services. On Wednesday night, if you wanted, as I grew older, if you wanted to date, you could have a date on Wednesday night, provided you went with your date to prayer meeting. Otherwise, you could not date during the week. Sometimes, though, I would slip off and go to the picture show by myself with my friends, but my date always came and sat by me. That was the way we got by with things of that kind. The most exciting thing I remember about a child was when Guy would come around. Guy left home when I was in about the 5th grade. I had worshipped and adored him. I thought he was about the greatest person I had ever known. He was so much fun to be around. When he'd walk into the house, regardless of what my mother was doing, he'd grab Mother around the waist and dance all over the house with her. We'd follow right behind, all laughing, singing, frolicking. Mama was always so serious about everything. It was a joy to have Guy to come home because Guy was so much fun. My summers were mostly, as a child, were mostly spent with the Tanny Hills. I spent a great deal of my time visiting the Tanny Hills. That was George and Devin and James and myself, and we went from one house to the other. First, we'd go visit in Winfield at James's house. Then we'd go to Urania and visit George. We seldom visited Nevin because her sister Nancy was so very, very mean that we were afraid of her. But when she was in a good humor, Miss Tannehill would call us and say, "You can come to our house now. Nancy is in a good humor." Nancy would really be a lot of fun when she was in a good humor. There were about 12 of us that ran around together in Ruston. We really had a wonderful time. We went on picnics. We'd have slumber parties. Our mothers would fix our lunch on Saturday mornings. We'd start out. We'd first take our breakfasts out. Miss Bob Davis used to come in her great big old Cadillac with her chauffeur, oftentimes with a hamper of food. But the one place I could always go spend the night was at Charlotte's house, and Charlotte could always come spend the night with me. My mother was very, very strict about with whom I ran around and where I would go to spend the night. We did about the same thing all little girls do. We had a lot of fun, but our families were all very strict with us. They were very careful as to whom and where we went. We always had to be well chaperoned. My mother had to know exactly who the parents were, all about them, before she would allow any of us to go any place of the kind. I finished high school in 3.5 years. Not that I was all that smart. It was just the idea that went to school, Ruth Robinson and I were very close, and she and I took the same subjects. And we finished high school ahead of our class. We went to college at midterm and had a fabulous time while we were at college. The first sorority was founded on the campus about the time we were freshmen. And, of course, we were chosen right off to be in the group to go in after the first group that had gone in. We were the first ones to be rushed. And we had a fabulous time. And after that, we took a very active part in the sorority. Of course, along the way, I had met the boy that I went out with. His family was very anxious for him to go with me, and my family was very anxious for me to go with him. His daddy had been the founder of Tech. He was kind of prissy about a lot of things. He wore white linen suits, and he was always scared to death that he might get a wrinkle in his suit. But he carried me around like I was a Dresden doll, almost, you could say. I wasn't allowed to do a lot of things that a lot of the other girls were doing at that time. He was as strict about his ideas as my mother was. And of course, that suited her fine. There was Keith and Robert and Dick Baskerville and Donna. And they were all, I don't know which one I went with, because they were always all along, and they were always, now you mustn't say this and you mustn't do that. And if I went with anyone that they didn't think was just right, they were one of them was sitting on my steps when I got home to rake me over the coals. But I'm very happy that they were that nice to me as I went along through college, because I really had a happy, and I ran around with nice girls. And one of my best friends was Eugenia Centel. Her husband later became governor of the state. I've lost track with Eugenia, but anytime she sees anyone from Kaplan, she always asks about me. They were darling girls. Her sisters were all lovely. And I'm very happy to have been a close friend of Eugenia's. And we did have a delightful time going through college. We oftentimes double-dated and had a very lovely time. As I have said before, Guy left home when I was in about the 5th grade. Before leaving home, I didn't tell you that my daddy was a lawyer. And he was getting old, and he spent much of his time at that time during the Depression down taking care of the farm. The farm was in Grand Parish. It was my mother's home place. Of course, he owned quite a bit of other land, but the real farm was on the old place. Not that the main crop was hay, and he raised a lot of cattle on the side. He wasn't at home too much, only on weekends. And I was the only little girl in the neighborhood that was treated like a little boy. There were no boys in the neighborhood. Consequently, before Guy left home, he took me in the backyard. He gave me an axe, and he said, "Now, Sarah, you're going to learn how to use this axe." I'll never forget that. That was a great big axe, and it was a double axe. It wasn't just a single axe, it was a double axe. I could use either side. He said, "Mama is oftentimes, in her Scottish ways, will order wood that is too big for the stove. You'll have to learn to cut it to fit the stove. She tries to save some money, and she orders sometimes it's too long, so before you can take it in, you'll have to see if it fits." So he stood there with me several afternoons and made me learn to use an axe. I became quite good at it. Of course, we had no gas at that time. Mama's stove in the kitchen was a great big iron cook stove. It was huge. Then we had a stove in the back bedroom, and of course the fireplace in the living room. The stove in the back bedroom didn't have a very big opening, and she oftentimes ordered blocks. I don't think you've ever seen, I don't imagine you order those blocks. And sometimes they were pretty big, and I had to use that axe to cut those blocks in half. Oftentimes, her stove wood was too long, and I'd have to take and use the axe on that. Then sometimes she ordered coal. Oh, I hated the food with coal. But I kept enough wood going to keep us warm all during the winter and for her to cook. When it was real cold, our next-door neighbor was Miss Smith. She was a widow, and she had only 2 daughters. Those 2 daughters were not living with her at that time, so she was alone. And if it were very cold, Mama would say, "Oh, Sarah, I feel so sorry for Miss Smith. I'm so afraid she might fall on those steps." There were 17 steps to both her house and our house in the back. She said, "Suppose she'd fall and hurt herself. Why don't you go ask her if you can't take in her wood?" Well, Miss Smith must have had a little bit more money than we had, because her wood was always just right. I never did have to cut it with an axe. But I'd go and I'd take in her wood. Fanny's mother, my sister-in-law's mother, lived up the street on the next street. And she was old, and she lived alone. When I would finish with Miss Smith, Mama would often say, "Now go take in Miss McLeese's," and I'd go take it in. Of course, if they were out of bread or eggs or something of the kind, when I would go, they would say, "Sarah, I'll give you a nickel if you'll go to town and bring me back a loaf of bread." Well, those nickels were so hard to come by, I would have done anything to have gotten that nickel. Didn't mind going to town. I loved to go to town. So off I'd go to town, usually with my skates. I'd make it in no time and bring it back, and I'd hoard my nickel. I wouldn't dare tell anybody in the family I had a nickel, because probably it would have been taken away from me. But I used my nickel the next day to buy a dill pickle. I love dill pickles. I didn't like candy. I liked dill pickles. And we'd sit on the fence next to the school, and we'd all have our nickels, and we'd eat our dill pickles. Another thing that I did around the house that I remember, I was so particular about my clothes, I didn't want anyone else to iron them. I wanted to iron them myself, and of course I spent time, and I was kind of proud. I wanted my few little dresses to look as good as anybody else's, so I would take time, and I would do my dresses up just beautifully, if I say so myself. Francis and Kathleen didn't like to iron. They started putting up a howl that my dresses always looked better than theirs. Mama then decided, well, the thing that she should do is to iron their dresses too. Oftentimes I'd iron as many as 15 linen dresses within an hour and a half's time. I'd do that between classes after I went to Tech. I'd come down the railroad track, head home. Mama would have the ironing board up. The clothes would be sprinkled. She would have starched them just so, because I wouldn't iron a dress unless she had starched it and sprinkled it. I didn't want anyone else to do it. I'd get those dresses out. I'd go to town. I'd iron as hard as I could iron. Redress, get back to school in time for my afternoon classes. Mama didn't know I came down the railroad track. I never did tell her that that was the way I got home so fast and the way I went back to school so fast, because she would have really punished me. When I graduated from college, the depression was really terrible. There was no jobs. We tried and tried to get a job. Couldn't find jobs. Ruth, Catherine, and I used to get one car after another, and we'd go for interviews for this superintendent and that superintendent and another superintendent. No jobs. Finally, Joel called Mama one day, and he said, "Send Sarah to me. I want her to babysit." So Mama packed my clothes, and I went to Joel's, South Louisiana in Lafayette. He said, we're going to interview all the superintendents in this section. He called different ones and set up appointments. We first went to Crowley. There were no vacancies in Acadia Parish. From there, we went to Opelousas. Nothing. He called Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams had graduated from Tech. We went. Mr. Williams was very, very lovely to me. He questioned me about Tech at that time. He says, well, I tell you, I have 2 vacancies. Burnside was from Ruston. The minute he said gate on, Joel says, that's the one we want. We put Sarah under Mr. Burnside. Teaching was so different then. Living condition for teachers was so different. I'll never forget the first place we stayed was with the Rileys. Nell Levy and I. Nell had graduated from USL. The Rileys were from Indiana. They were as different from anyone I had ever known in all. I'd never known anyone like that. They were, I don't know, I would say they were peculiar. I only stayed there a few weeks. I couldn't take it. Nellie and I then moved in with Mr. and Miss Noel, who were newly married. He taught agriculture. Very, very nice. We stayed there a year. The next year, we joined Eleanor and Dervalar and Dot Causey, and we lived upstairs at Miss Abraham's. We stayed there a year. During that year, Dot married. So did Nell. Eleanor and I started rooming together, and we moved to the Terrios. We lived there for about a year, and then Mary Bonet opened the upstairs of her house, and that was where I stayed the rest of the time. I love Mary and Leo. They were wonderful to us. During that time, we were not paid cash. We were often given script. I remember one time I had $3 to my name. That $3 had to go the whole 3 months. Finally, somebody in town said, if you let me, I'll cash your script. It was Joe Favaloro. He made money off the script, but we couldn't hold it any longer because we just had to have money. One time at Christmas, they let us out a week beforehand. I didn't have a red copper cent, not a penny, a whole week before Christmas. We weren't going to get paid either. I called Mama Collect. She was furious because I had called her Collect. I didn't have any money, though. I couldn't call her anyway but Collect. I told her, I said, Mama, we're out, and I have no way to come home. I have no money at all. So she says, well, I think Francis is out, too. I'll send Donnan in the car, and he'll pick you up tomorrow. So I waited and waited, but it was 2 days before the car got there. Donna came for us. It was cold. Oh, it was so cold. We got to Ellick, and it was snowing. Luckily, Donna was a good driver. We'd start down a hill. We didn't know whether we were going to get back up or whether we were going to land down at the bottom or what was going to happen to us. It took us 5 hours to go from Ellick to Ruston. We got to Ruston safely, but I opened the door, stepped out, and immediately fell flat on my face on a piece of ice. During that time, I was having myself a good time. I just gone with one person all the way through college, but I found out you could have a good time going with a lot of different people. Eleanor had introduced me to a couple of real nice people in Lafayette, and of course Lionel Berry, who was a friend of ours. And we started going to dances, and I was having a good time. Then there was a teachers' convention in Monroe, and that's where I met B.J. I had gone up for other purposes, but I met B.J., and after that, we were married. Shortly. I was still engaged to Donna, though. That's it. After I married B.J., I spent about 6 months at the house. I was very unhappy doing nothing. I was not trained to be a housekeeper. I did not know how to cook. Thought it was much better for us to hire someone to come cook and do the housework and let me go back to work. Gabi Murray, who was a good friend of Joel's, asked me if I would work at the welfare. Back in that day and time, you know, when you married, they didn't like to hire married teachers. And particularly, since my husband was principal, it was impossible for me to teach in Calvert. Now, I driven back and forth to Gaydon every day, and I certainly wasn't planning to stay in Gaydon. And BJ wasn't making a very big salary, even though he was principal of a big school. His salary was maybe $120 a month or something of the kind, and the two of us were trying to live on that. Bobby said, Sarah, if you want to go to work, I'll find you a job. I said, okay, anything. He called me one day and he says, would you work at the welfare office? Gladly, anything that I can find to do. I was hired immediately and went to work. My experience in the welfare really helped me greatly as as time went by. I had a better understanding of people, their home habits, the way they lived in South Louisiana. There was such a difference in the very poor and the very rich, and even a great deal of difference in the middle class. I had not felt that difference ever before. I'll never forget Olive Harrington. One day told Bebe McClellan, who is a very dear friend of mine in Abbeville, she and I were both from about the same type of homes, been brought up very similar. She sat us down and she says, now girls, I'm going to tell you something. You're going to go into homes that you've never been in before. You're going to meet people that you didn't know even existed. When you go into those homes, regardless of how small they are or what they look like, always find something about that house that you can say is nice, that you like. That was the greatest teaching of anybody that had ever taught me anything. In fact, I learned more from Olive Harrington than anybody that I had ever come across. She took time to talk with Bebe and me to explain the living habits of these people in whose homes we were going into. She gave us a greater understanding of people. And you know, she nearly lost her job when we all had to take our tests because she had only a 7th grade education. If Bebe and I hadn't pled and begged and explained to the state director who came in and wanted Olive to be fired and explained to her that we had learned more about welfare, the working of the poor people, than their needs, than we had in all the books that we had studied along the way. Olive had a great influence on my life at that time, and I appreciate everything she ever did do for me. She was much older, and she had reared a family. She didn't work too long because she was fortunate enough her daddy had left her land, and she struck oil on that land. We were all so happy when Olive got enough money that she didn't have to work, that she was able to retire and live her old age in happiness. But she was really much older than we were. I stayed at the welfare for 6 years. During that time, the war came on, and BJ had to go into the service. I remained at home a year until he was transferred in Corpus Christi. It was very difficult to find a place for anyone to live in Corpus Christi, and he kept trying. And finally, I called him, and I told him, I said, look, whether you have a place or not, I'm coming. I remember packing my house, closing my house, and there was another girl and her baby who had to go to meet her husband. I've forgotten even their names. But she came with me, and we drove my car, which was piled to high heaven with, I don't know, all the stuff that we didn't have in there. And we went to Corpus Christi. It took us from early in the morning till we didn't get in there until late at night. I don't know. I think she drove after dark, or maybe I did. I don't know. But we made it. And we got to Corpus Christi. She met her husband, and I met BJ. He said, Sarah, you can't, I think he was getting $99 a month. He says, we're going to have to find something for you to do if you want to stay out here. I said, well, I've resigned my job, now I'm coming to stay. We went to the labor board. I had made applications to the labor board before, and Miss Taylor, my supervisor in the welfare, had written a very They said, oh, we've been waiting for you. We have your job. Can you go to work in the morning? And I said, oh, yes, I can go to work in the morning. We didn't have a place to stay. The first place we had was horrible. We didn't even have an electric icebox or anything. We had to lock the door. We couldn't leave the door unlocked, and we couldn't get ice. So one of the men on the base told BJ, says, well, we have a house, but next to our house there's a couple, and they have a room with a little tiny kitchen. Maybe y'all could stay there. I said, well, anything. So we moved there, and I went to work at the welfare. In the neighborhood, there were some people. There were some sailors. So we'd take turns driving. Here I was sitting, two sailors. We drove one day in one car, one day in the other car, one day in the other car. But I worked the whole time. While I was working, an old Navy doctor, I had gone to see him about something I don't even remember. And he asked me, he says, you don't have children, do you? And I said, no. He says, you have the worst case. Your case, a thyroid, is the worst I have ever seen. He looked at my arm. He drew a line down my arm. He says, honey, you are in need of thyroid. I said, well, no one had ever told me. He says, have you ever had a complete checkup? I said, no, but I've been to doctors for various things, but not very much. He says, well, right here and now, you're going to take thyroid. And I did. In 3 months' time, that I went back to him, and he said, honey, you're pregnant. And I was delighted. BJ was delighted, and everybody in the office, we had a party almost in the office when I walked in and told them that I was going to have a baby. Everybody was excited. They even let me call BJ, and they got BJ. BJ was he oftentimes worked in the captain's office, the admiral's office, he and one of his friends. And that was where he was, and I called him and told him he was very surprised. Soon after that, BJ became an officer, and he was transferred to New York. So he took me to Ruston, and there I sat. Molly Lawler, a very close friend of mine through college, had come back home too. She was pregnant, and we both sat it out over a bridge table. We played bridge from 9 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night, all day long, either at my house or Molly's house. Barris Armstrong was also at home. Her husband was across. He was a captain in the Army. Then Virginia oftentimes came, and if Virginia, the four of us usually played, but if Virginia left, why, we'd find someone to take her place. If Miss Lawler often played with us, too. If we were at home, Bill or Francis would take their turn in playing with us. Well, Guy was born in Ruston at the hospital there. Dr. Green was the doctor. The day before he was born, Ruth came up to see us, and she and I took a 2-mile walk all the way back to the house, past Love's house. We got home. Ruth says, I don't think I'd better go back to Hodge. I think I'd better stay here. Ruth spent the night. The next day, Guy was born at noon. Everybody had left the hospital. I was there alone. I told them I felt good. So everybody went home for lunch. And while they were at lunch, Guy was born. When Ruth got back to the hospital, she couldn't believe that I had already had my baby and was feeling great, ready to talk. Everything was going fine. I remember Mama and Annie came, and they stayed with me a while. I stayed in Ruston till Guy was about 6 months old. Then I went to New York and stayed with BJ. We stayed at a great big farm, on a great big farm, dairy farm. We had the whole upstairs. The people were lovely but old. After Guy was about a year old, we returned to Kaplan and went back to work. when we got back to Kaplan, we had sold our house to Anna Mae and Ed Vilmer. So we didn't have a house. We went to live with Mrs. Sledge. She let us stay in one side of her apartment, but she was so perfectly terrible. I could not stand her. She stuck her nose into all my business. She was critical of everything. If I let God do one little thing, she nearly had a fit. And of course, her daughter was living there too, and her daughter's little girl, Peggy. Well, Guy and Peggy just couldn't get in the same room together without scratching one another to death. And I don't know, I just had enough of Miss Sledge. And one day at noon, Daddy came in. I called him and said, "You come home at noon." I told him my suitcase was packed. I said, "After school, you're going to take me back to Ruston. I refuse to spend another night under this roof with Miss Sledge. I had enough. Can't take her." So he says, "Okay, but I have to go right now. I have to go to Dr. Latchley's house. I have to go see him about someone that got sick at school. I have to go find out about them. And I'll leave early, and I'll drive you to Ruston right after school." He got to Mrs. Latchley's, and he broke down. He told Miss Latchley, he says, "Sarah's had enough of Miss Sledge. She can't take it." He said, "She can't take it, and I can't either. I'm going to take her back to Ruston until I can find her another place to stay." Miss Latchley says, "You are not taking Sarah back to Ruston. You two have been separated from one another long enough. Now, she's gone through the war. She is not going back to Ruston." He just says, "Well, what in the world?" She says, "Well, rather than have her to go back to Ruston, you're going to bring her here. She's going to stay with us. She is not going." She says, "BJ, I have that little tea house out there. Let's go look at it. Let's see if we can't fix that house so you all can move into it until you can find a house." He went with Mrs. Latchley and Dr. Latchley, and they looked at the little tea house in the backyard. It wasn't a little tea house. I had partied there many a time. We'd had fabulous times in that little tea house. She says, "Now, you see, we can easily put a bed in here, and we can arrange the furniture around. You have a stove." The stove was already there. She says, "With Sarah's bed, we can get her bedroom set, and we can put it in here, and you can be very comfortable. The only thing you don't have is a tub." He just says, "Well, Sarah will bathe in the lavatory rather than go home." We moved in that afternoon after school. Lucy had my bedroom set. I had left it at Lucy's when we broke up housekeeping. We moved in. I spent that night at the tea house. Miss Sledge was furious. She was so mad she didn't know what to do, but I was sorry. I just could not stay there any longer. While we were there, one little room, no tub. Sometimes I'd go to Amy's and get a good bath. But otherwise, I either bathed in a bowl or I took just a spit bath. During that time, Kathleen was born. Rather, I got pregnant for Kathleen during that time. And Mrs. Dr. Saporita and Miss Saporita had a little red house. And it was a catacomb across the street from where Virginia lived, and next door to Lily Mae Latour. They had told me that I could have that house, that someone was going to move out in just a few weeks. Well, they urged the people out, and we moved into Miss Saporita's little red house. And it was while we were living there that Kathleen was born. During my pregnancy for Kathleen, Guy was constantly sick. He was sick all the time. He had been spent that year up in Ruston and in New York State, and he had a hard time becoming acclimated to the dampness in South Louisiana. And of course, the house that we lived in was pretty damp, too. It wasn't a very well-built house. I had a time with Guy. He would run high fever. Dr. Young did everything he could to try to help me, but I don't imagine Dr. Young was very up on medicine. He was wonderful, though. He gave you a lot of comfort by just being there when he was sick. Kathleen was born in Abbeville. Dr. Young was the doctor. She was a beautiful baby. I remember she was born on a Sunday morning. I kept telling BJ, when we got near the country club, I kept telling him, look, you better hurry. I'm going to have a country club baby right here. He dropped me at the hospital. Dr. Young was there, met me at the door. BJ went to get Flo, my sister-in-law, to come stay. While he was gone, Kathleen was born, and I was back in my room when he and Flo walked in with the prettiest little girl you ever did see. We stayed in the hospital for about 2 hours, and Dr. Young walked in, and he says, how you feeling? I said, fine, I want to go home. He says, okay, you can go home. So Kathleen and I returned to Kaplan. She was the best baby, but she had to be a good baby because we didn't have time to fool with her. We were too busy fooling with Guy. I can remember sitting and rocking Guy and talking to Kathleen. Even as she grew older, Daddy built some kind of little thing that we could stick her in, and she could sit up on the bed. And I'd rock Guy, and I'd talk with her. But she was good. She didn't give us any trouble. She was a beautiful baby, though, the prettiest baby that I think that was ever born in Kaplan. That's what everyone said. 3 years old. They called me from Gaydon. Mr. Bush called and asked me if I could come and substitute for about 2 weeks until they could find a teacher for the 6th grade. I told him that I would. Thelma had just told me that she would come back to work for me. Thelma had worked for me for about 10 years. She had been helping me before I went to Wash. In fact, Thelma started working for me soon after I arrived in Kaplan, and she worked with me for me until I went with joined BJ in the service. She had told me that she would start working for me that next day. I went to get Thelma, and she said yes, that she was going to come, so I went to Gaydon to work. Thelma started working at the house. Kathleen was 3, Guy was 5. They were both going to kindergarten with Miss Maud Theriot. I worked in Gaydon the 2 weeks, and Mr. Bush walked in my room. He says, oh, Sarah, you're not going to leave us. Can't you take that job? So I said, okay, I'll take it. So I stayed in Gaydon for about 5. I stayed in Gaydon till Guy was in the 7th grade, and Kathleen was in the 5th. The only reason I came back to Kaplan the summer before I returned to Kaplan, came to Kaplan to teach, I became violently ill. I had a ruptured gallbladder. I had suffered with it all my life, but nobody had ever told me I had gallbladder. I was so used to throwing up. Something disagreed with me, I'd go throw up and come on back and go on about my business. I didn't pay any attention to it. I had been having it since I was about 18. Well, it popped. It nearly popped me off, too. It poisoned my whole system. And the doctor didn't think he could save me, but I really think it was Kathleen and Guy praying so hard for me. They said, Kathleen knew where the operating room was, and she and Guy came, and they stayed on the outside of the operating room. And I was told later that they prayed the whole time. They had been to church to pray for me, and I still think that that's the only reason that I lived was their prayers. God listened to them and allowed me to continue living, because with what I had, Dr. Vilmaez told me later, he says, you weren't supposed to live. He says, I still think it's a miracle. And the miracle was the prayers that my 2 children had for their mother. After that, Mr. Baker, who was our school board member from Gaydon, from whom I loved very much, I was best crazy. He was from Gina, and he knew all the Tanny Hills. We weren't related, but we were related to some of the same people. He went to the school board office, and he says, now listen, that rule about Sarah's not teaching in Kaplan, that's for the birds. She's been coming over there long enough. Now, I want her to teach in Kaplan. There's no need for her to have to come on that road every day as she's been doing. I want her right here in Kaplan. He says, I've done favors for you, now you're going to do a favor for me. You're going to put Sarah in Kaplan. I was put in Kaplan with the idea of teaching history, which I loved. I was given English the day I started teaching there. I had not prepared. I hadn't had any grammar, probably since I left high school. Given a book and said, this is what you're going to teach. Leroy Robichaud was put in our school unbeknownst to BJ. When he walked into the faculty meeting the morning of the first day of school, Leroy was sitting there, and BJ says, what are you doing here, Leroy? He says, well, I'm supposed to be teaching for you. Leroy was qualified for social studies. He could not teach math. He could not teach English. He was not qualified for English. I was qualified for English. I was qualified for social studies. My favorite was social studies. BJ came to me. He says, I'm sorry, you'll just have to take the social studies. You'll have to take the English. It was the most miserable year I've ever taught in my life. I wish many times that I was back in Gaydon. Finally, remembered enough grammar that the next year I wasn't too bad a teacher, but it was hard.